Hello everybody, welcome to part 2 of ASP.NET Role Customization in MVC Identity. Today we're going to be creating a simple web page to manage users and also assign and deassign roles to a specific user. For this purpose, we'll be creating a simple repository pattern to access data from our database. And finally, we'll see a simple demo of how access is given or denied based on the page we just built. Hang on and stay till the end. Thank you. Okay, now let's get started. Let's take a quick look at the website we had built in the last episode. We had a simple website with a couple of pages for manager and admin, and based on the roles assigned to a user, they'll have access or denied access to a page. We currently are logged in as test2. Let's quickly go and check the roles we are assigned to test2. So this gentleman has two roles, user and manager. So if you go to the manager page, we have access. If you go to the admin page, we get access denied message. Great. Now let's build a page where we can see the roles assigned to this user and also add or edit roles. So let's go back to our Visual Studio, a new folder. We're going to call this user, and we're going to add a new view. It's an MVC view, empty view, add index. Okay, we have a simple page here. And then let's come to our controllers and add a new controller. We're going to call it user controller. Okay, here we have a simple view, and then let's go to our users in view, and let's just put some data here just to see if it works. We're going to call it. Just copy something from here. Users page. Okay, now let's build a project. Okay, now if we come to our browser and go to user, there we go, we have a users page. Okay, now let's build this page. So this page is going to have a model of collection of application user. It's going to automatically import it for us, and then we're going to have a class of text center. Actually, let's put it inside here. Okay, and then if we have any model.any, only if we have any items in the list, we're going to build a table of actually let's go to Bootstrap's website and get a quick table. Get Bootstrap. Okay, let's go to examples. Actually, let's go to docs, tables. Let's copy this table code. Let's paste it here. We don't need all these rows. Let's remove these. Let's remove this at. We're gonna first, last, email, and then we'll put an edit. Okay, so here we're gonna put at. Here we're gonna loop through the users. So let's put for each where user in model. We're gonna put this inside the quotes. So put user.id, and instead of mark we'll have user.firstname, user.lastname, user.email, and here we're gonna have a link. We'll give it to the user controller, and the action is going to be edit. We'll have to add that, and ASP route ID is going to be at user.id, and the text is edit. So let's quickly come to the user controller and add a iAction result of edit. We're just going to simply return a view. Let's build it and see if it works. Awesome. Now let's go to our it's returning null, so let's put, it won't work, so let's do okay, let's build, and let's, okay, cool. Now we still have the page. Let's start building a repository. So the first, I'm going to add a new folder in our core folder called repositories, and I'm going to add an interface here. Add new item. We're going to add an interface called user user repository. Okay, and in this interface we're going to have an collection of application user, and then we're going to call it get users. So this is a simple repository with one function. The next step is to implement this repository. For that, I'm going to add a folder in our main project called repositories. Add a new item called, with a class name called user repository. Okay, and in this, let's rename this to the correct name, repository. Okay, so this class is going to implement the iUser repository, and we're going to implement all the missing members. So okay, now next step is to inject the context into our constructor. Our context application db context, and we're gonna introduce a field, and we are gonna initialize the variable. Great. Now here we're just gonna simply return context dot users dot toList, the simple repository that returns all the users. Awesome. So the next is we're gonna add a new interface called, let's call this iUnit of work. As you can tell, we're implementing the unit of work repository. This pattern is kind of explanations out of the scope of this lesson, but it's a very useful repository pattern that's widely used in most enterprise applications. Just follow along for now. We'll probably go on the explanation in another lecture. So let's call, here we get access to our user repository. So here I'm going to say user repository, and they're going to call it users get. That's awesome. So now let's add the implementation in our repositories. So let's call this unit of work. Okay, now let's implement iUnit of work. Let's implement all the properties, and now we're going to implement the constructor, and here we're going to inject a user repository, and we're going to initialize that variable. Initialize auto property. That is great. Now the next step is to make sure all the dependency injection is set up. For that, we're going to go to our program.cs, and we're going to add a new function called add scoped. We're going to go to the very end and add this function add scoped builder.services.add scoped. First is going to be iUser repository. It's going to map to user repository. User repository, yep. And then we're gonna add builder.services.add scoped iUnit of work to unit of work. Okay, once we have these two, let's build it. Great. So what we're doing here technically, so iUser repository and iUnit of work are the interfaces which we will have in our project usually, and these two repositories will be in a separate project or an API or a microservice that gives us data. So this is like a simple example to explain how it works. So now let's go back to our controller, and here we're going to inject our unit of work repository, unit of work, and then we're gonna introduce a read-only property, and here we're gonna say users is equal to unit of work dot user dot get users, and in our view we're gonna return the users. Okay, now let's build a project. Wonderful. Now let's go back. Here we go. It's awesome. It's automatically built it for us, and we have the list of all the users here. Okay, now let's start building the user edit page. So right now, if we click on this, there's no page, so it won't work. So let's go to our controller and add a string called ID, and we're just going to return that ID for now. So let's return it as a content of ID. So let's quickly build this. Okay, now let's go back to our application, restart. Okay, here we go. So we get the ID back. That's great. So the next step is to go to the database and get the user associated with this ID. So for that, we're gonna add a couple of methods to our iUser repository. So let's go to iUser repository. We're gonna say we're gonna return an application user, and we're gonna get a user with a string of ID. Okay, and then we're gonna go to our user repository. So as you can see, we get an error saying we gotta implement. So if we're gonna implement this, we're gonna say context.users.first, our default user ID is goes to ID. Okay, so that's great. So now let's build a project. Okay, let's come back to our controller. So let's come here and say where user is equal to unit of work dot user dot get user, and we're going to pass the ID, and let's just pass the username, user dot first name. Okay, rebuilt. Let's go back, refresh. Our first name should be test1. Let's edit, and we get test1. Great, our controller is working. We're getting the data from the database. Now let's build the edit page. Add some fields for first name, last name, roles, etc. Okay, let's go to Bootstrap. We're gonna go to our examples. Let's go and get one of these sample forms. Where is a sample form that we can use? Okay, here's a checkout field. Okay, let's use this. Now let's go to inspect, and we're going to take everything from our container. Okay, let's copy the entire container, and let's come back to our edit. So let's add actually a view right here. So let's call this user add view. We're gonna call it let's call it edit. Okay, now here let's paste what we copied. As you can see, we have a lot of unwanted stuff here. We'll remove that very shortly. Okay, your cart. Let's see how it looks first. Let's go back to our user controller. We're gonna return a view. And we're gonna pass user. Let's build. Oh, we have some errors. Okay, let's rebuild. Okay, now let's come back here Let's Repo. It's loading. Great. Now let's go to edit page. Okay, we have some bare bones. Okay, now let's quickly bind the model to our application user so that we have access to data. And let's bind the first name input text field to our first name from our model. Okay, let's check. Let's quickly build and go back to our browser and check. Okay, that's great. We have our first name. And then let's do the same for the rest of our properties and check. Okay, so I have cleaned up this page. So let's see how it looks. So here we have a simple first name, last name, email, and we have the roles. Here we're going to have a bunch of checkboxes listing all the roles, and we'll check off the ones which this user has access to. So let's go ahead and do that. So in order to list a bunch of roles, let's go to the controller. Here we pass the user. So instead we should pass a new class that contains the user as well as the roles. For that, we're going to have to change the view model of this control for this view. So let's go and create a view model. You're going to add a new view model, add class edit user view model. Here we're going to have first the application user. We're going to call it the user, and then we're going to have an enumerable of role. I don't think we ever created a role. So in order to get the role from the database, in order to get access here, we're going to have to make a small change. Let's go to application user, and we're going to initialize a class called application role identity, which inherits from identity role, and that's it. Once we do that, we can call it application role here, and this is going to be roles. Wonderful. Now the next step is to come to our view model, and the model here, it's going to be edit user view model, and we'll have to replace all the at model dot width at model dot user dot. Now let's replace everything, and everything's good. Now let's come back to our controller. So we're going to initialize a new controller called VM is equal to new edit user view model. We're going to pass the user as the user, and let's pass the VM. Okay, let's build. Let's preview this in our application. Let's see if this is going to work, and it works. Wonderful. Now let's come here, and we'll have to add a new repository to get the roles. Let's do that. Okay, let's add a new repository by first adding a contract to the repositories. Add new item. We're going to call it interface role. Actually, we're going to call it I role repository, and this one's going to have an I collection of application role, and we're going to call this get roles. Following this, we're going to implement this in our main repository. Add a new class. We are going to call it role repository, and this is going to implement I role repository. Let's implement all the members. Okay, let's initialize the constructor, inject the application DB context. Let's call it context, and let's initialize a read-only field. And once we get that, we can return context dot roles dot to list. Okay, this one's saying, okay, let's see what, okay, we made a mistake. We might have to change this back to identity role in our, where's our iUser repository? And actually no, it's in the iRole repository. We're gonna call this identity role. Okay, and then in our role repository, I'm gonna change this to identity role. Once we do that, okay, that's good. Let's build. Wonderful. Once we get the roles, let's come back to our controller. Here, actually, we got to add our roles to our unit of work. For that, let's go to iUnit of work, iRole repository, role. Then we're gonna put a get accessor. And then let's come back to our unit of work. Let's implement the missing member, and we're going to initialize a property from the constructor. Awesome. So once we do that, we're going to have to add the transient in our program.cs. Let's come to our add scoped. Let's duplicate this. iRole repository maps to role repository. Wonderful. Now let's come back to our user controller. We're going to get the roles here. Unit of work role.get roles. Once we do that, we're going to put the roles as roles. Actually, we'll have to change this view model. This is going to be identity role. Okay, let's come back, rebuild. Awesome. Now let's come back to our form right here, and here, form check. What we're going to do is we're going to have a loop at for each where role in at model.roles. Let's open and close. Let's copy this section. Let's just print the name for now at role.name. Okay, let's remove all these ones. Okay, let's rebuild. Let's come back to our page, refresh. Wonderful. Here we have all the roles now. Now next step, we're going to change these into a checkbox and check only the roles that this user has been assigned to. Alright, so I made some updates to this checkbox. I added the corresponding ASP.NET binding fields, ASP.NET ID, and the 4. Let's quickly check how it looks. And this is what we have. We have admin, user, and manager. All of them are checked. But let's see how to check only the ones that are selected. For that, we'll first have to go here to our identity model and update this to a select list item. Okay, and then here what we'll actually do is we'll pass, let's debug this, sorry, let's decompile it. Here we'll pass it as a text value and a selected field. This will give us like a view model interface to automatically populate it from our controller. So let's go to our user controller, and then right here let's get where list is equal to new list of I'd select list item. We're going to put roles, role list.add new list item. We're going to put role.name, role.id, and selected. Let's currently put it to false, and let's rename this to role items, and then here we're going to pass role items. Let's build. What do we have here? We have a problem. Oh, okay. So we're going to update this here. We're going to call it dot instead of ID, let's call this value. This is going to be value, and this is going to be text. Okay, let's build. Let's check our application. I think our application quit. Let's rebuild. And we have it. Okay, awesome. So let's bind the checked to at role dot selected, and also we're going to have to update the role. It's not exactly a good name. Actually, let's do it as role. Let's build. I think we currently pass all the values as false, so it should not be selected. And there we go, it's not selected. Okay, in order to get the roles that this user is currently assigned, we have a built-in feature in MVC identity. We use that in our login page. Let's go here, login. Here we have something called a sign-in manager, which gives us access to the user manager. The user manager has the roles for any user, which we can easily use to check what roles that user has. So we're gonna inject that sign-in manager right here. So let's check what's the name. Sign-in manager. Sign-in manager of application user. Sign-in manager, we're gonna call that. Let's check, yeah. And let's introduce a read-only field. Okay, now we will have the sign-in manager injected right here. So let's get all the user roles. User roles is equal to sign-in manager.user manager.get roles for the user, and we're going to pass the user. Okay. Alright, now let's quickly put a breakpoint here and run this. Okay, we have our application built. Let's go to users. Let's go our test2. Okay, let's press F10, and we have, oh, we did a mistake. We'll have to await it because it's an async method. Okay, let's run it again. And because it's async, it has to be async here and task. Alright, let's press F5. And here it comes. Let's go to users. Let's go to user 2. Okay, let's press F10. We have two roles, user and manager. Wonderful. Now let's top this application.
Mac OS contains a built-in screen reader called VoiceOver. If you
Okay, sorry about that. That was my Mac. Alright, now in order to set this to either true or false from our roles, we're gonna quickly say has role is equal to user roles.any user role dot contains role dot name. Okay, this will basically loop inside the user roles and check if the role exists inside. So all you have to do is say has role right here, and let's rebuild. Alright, now let's come back to our project, refresh. Oh, I think it exited. Control F5. Let's reload our page. Okay, so it doesn't work. Let's put a breakpoint. And let's go to users. Let's go to our user. Okay, so we're gonna get the user roles. We have user and manager. Okay, we for the first role is the administrator.
Mac OS contains a built-in screen reader.
So let's come here. User role has false. That's correct. The second one should be true. Has role is true. Okay, let's check. Okay, wonderful. It did work. It probably didn't build properly. So we have the user and manager checked. That is awesome. So now let's see how we can post this data back to the form and save it to the database. Okay, before we jump onto our form, let's quickly refactor this whole method. Right now it looks a bit messy. So we can do a couple of updates here. Instead of having a for each here, we can simply write this into a select statement. Let me see how to do that. So let's call it role items select is equal to roles dot select role goes to new select list item. I'm going to say role dot name, role dot ID, and here we're going to check user, and this is for the selected one, user roles dot any UR goes to, it's going a bit outside the screen, let's break this, UR dot contains role dot name. Okay, let's refactor, let's break this into a new line. Okay, let's check the layout, looks good. Okay, now take a look at these two. It has a couple of lines, this is a single line and way more cleaner. Now let's delete this and we're going to rename this to this. Wonderful, it looks way more cleaner now. Okay, now let's rebuild and check. Let's restart the application. Users, edit. Wonderful. Let's start building our post method here. We're going to call this public async task of I action result on post async, and this is going to get a view model of edit user view model. We're going to call this data, and let's just return a view. And let's mark this as HTTP post. Once we do that, we should be able to get the data. I noticed something. So here we use a form and the method is going to be post. So in best practice, it is advised to use the tag helpers. We're going to build a HTML.begin form. The first is we're going to give it the controller name, which is going to be user, and then we'll get IntelliSense here. Okay, we're going to pass this on post, and let's wrap the whole thing with a bracket, and we're going to remove the form. Okay, this way it's nice and clean. Now let's come back to our controller, let's put a breakpoint here and run our application. Okay, let's go to users, let's edit and submit. Okay, let's check this for now, and here we have our data. So we have our roles as null, we will get back to that, and we have our email, first name, last name, all the other stuff from the data. Awesome. Okay, now right now our data, when we post back, the roles is bound to null. That is because, let's go back to our form. Here we have a simple HTML implementation, and MVC doesn't know how to bind it to the roles I collection when it posts back. So let's fix that right here. So here I'm gonna write a for loop. Let's call it int I to 0. It goes from I to model.roles.count, and then I++. Let's open a loop, and they're going to copy this div. And inside this div, we're gonna write a HTML tag helper, HTML checkbox for checkbox goes to model.roles of I dot selected. Okay, we have an error here. It says cannot apply indexing. Yes, that is because, let's go to our roles. It's an IEnumerable. IEnumerable doesn't let us use an indexer like this. So in order to use it, let's implement an iList. And if we implement an iList here, we have to go to a controller and change the select statement to list. Once we do that, we should be able to apply an indexer. That's great. So now let's do the same for HTML.hidden for h goes to at model.roles, and we're going to bind a hidden field for the value of, okay, and then we're going to put a label for label goes to at model.roles at I, and we're going to put selected and model.roles of I dot text, and we're going to give it a new class. What's the class here? Form check label. Okay, once we do that, we need to give it a hidden field for the label. So let's give it h goes to at model.roles dot text. Okay, once we have that, let's delete this section. Okay, now let's run the project. No errors, that's great. Okay, let's go to users, edit. I'm going to select only user and manager and save. Let's come to data. Okay, we have 3 roles. The first role is the administrator, selected as false, and then we have user selected to true and manager selected to true. Wonderful. Now we have two-way data binding. Okay, now let's see how to update the user. The first step is to get the user from the database. We already do that here. Let's copy and paste it here. Okay, and then it's going to be a data.user.id. Okay, once we get it, we're going to check if user is null. Then we're going to return not found. Okay. If not, we're going to replace the user's first name with the data.firstname, data.user.firstname. Same thing for the last name, data.user.lastname, and then user.email goes to data.user.email. Okay, once we do that, we're going to have to update our database. So for that, we should actually write a new function in our user repository. So let's go to our user repository. Let's add a new method. Application user, update user. We're going to pass application user as a parameter and give user. Now let's implement this function. Let's go to our repository right here. Let's implement that function. Okay, so we are going to context.users.update. We're going to pass user. Okay, and this returns an application user, so let's just return it. Okay, we're getting an error. Why is that? Core tracking update. Actually, we have to call context.savechanges return user. Okay, wonderful. So here it adds the that adds the entity to the graph, and then we have to call save changes. Once we do that, we can return our user. So let's come back to our user controller, and we're going to say unit.work.users.update user. Okay, so now let's quickly run this project. Let's go to users. I'm going to change the first name to modified. Let's put a breakpoint here before we post back. Let's save. Okay, in our data, we get first name as modified. That's great. Let's go. Okay, it's saying our user is null because why is our user null? Data user ID looks correct. Okay, let's go back here. That's the same user we posted back. Let's run it again. Users, edit. The ID is DE. Okay, save. Oh, the ID is different. Why is that? It's DE, but we get it as D22. I know why. Because we're not binding the ID to any value. So we'll have to come back to our HTML form. Let's put a simple at html.hidden for h goes to at model.user.id. Okay, now let's run it. Users, edit, save. Okay, now let's see, our user is not null. Let's see if it updates our data. Okay, it did work. Now let's come back to the form and update the name. Modified, let's save. First name should be modified, yes, let's update it. That is great. Let's refresh this page, and here we go, we have it modified. Next step, let's bind the roles, add and delete. Okay, now let's start managing our roles. So we're going to come back to our edit method and copy this line. Let's paste it right here. Now we get all the roles assigned to the user. So now let's quickly write what we're going to do. So first, we're going to loop through the roles in the view model, and then check if the role is assigned in DB. If assigned, do nothing. If not assigned, add role. Okay, now let's see how to do that. So let's write a quick for each loop. We're going to put user roles in DB. Actually, let's loop over the data in the view form. Data roles. Let's call this a role. Okay, now let's quickly check if this exists in DB, exists in, or let's call it assigned in database. User roles. Let's rename this to user roles in DB. Oh, let's rename this again, user roles in DB. Okay, now first our default user role, it matches role.text. Okay, all right, now if assigned in DB is null, actually no, The first thing we're going to do is check if role is selected. Okay, let's do it this way. If role is selected, then we check if assigned in DB is null. Okay, so here basically we're checking if the role is set and it's not assigned in the DB, then we're gonna add role. All right, if its role is not selected and if assigned in DB is not equal to null, we're gonna remove the role. So what this basically means is, if in our front end, if you have this role selected and it's not assigned in the DB, we add it. And the second condition is, if the role is not selected, we come here and we check the database. Okay, is this already assigned? If it's not assigned, then we don't do anything. But if it's assigned, which means it's not equal to null, we remove it right here. So how do we do that? So that's very simple. We put sign in manager dot user manager dot add to role. We pass the user and we pass the role dot text, and we await it. And then similarly here we say await sign in manager dot user manager dot remove from role user role.text. Okay, now let's put a breakpoint and see if this works. Let's run our application. Let's go to users. Okay, first we're not going to change anything, and let's click on save. Okay, now let's check our roles. We have 3. The first one is our administrator. It's not selected, so it comes here. Assigned in DB is null, so it doesn't do anything. The next role is our user. Is it selected? True. Is assigned in DB null? Nope, it's already assigned, so it's not going to do anything. The third one is our manager. Is it selected? True. Is assigned in DB null? It's already assigned, so we're not going to do anything. And let's finish. We'll fix this error, but now let's go back. Let's remove the user role. Actually, let's remove the manager role. Let's click on save. Let's go through the loop again. The first role is administrator. There's no action. The second role is the user. We already have it assigned, so it's not going to do anything. The third role is our manager, which we just checked unchecked, so it's not selected and it's not equal to null, so it is going to remove this role. And then let's finish the page. Let's go back, let's refresh. There we go. We don't have the manager role here anymore. Let's check our database directly. Okay, we have a small error. Okay, let's run this. Okay, so we don't have user test2 at test.ca not assigned to the manager role anymore. Wonderful. Coming back to our onPost method, we have a small issue. Here inside the for each loop, while we assign or deassign roles, we're calling the database right here and here inside a for each loop. This is okay if there's only a few number of rows, but if you're assigning and deassigning probably tens or probably a couple of hundred roles, then it'll have a significant database delay. So we're going to remove this and replace it with a single call. Let's see how to do that. First, I'm going to initialize 2 lists. The first one is roles to add, called new. It's a new list of string. And then roles to delete. This is going to be another list. So here, instead of calling the database, we say roles to add role.text. Remove this method. Roles to delete.add role.text. Okay, once we do that, we come here. roles to add, we check if there's any, and then we call our sign-in manager, get access to our user manager, add roles. Here you have a second method that takes a user and an IEnumerable of roles. So here we're going to pass roles to add. Awesome. Similarly, we're going to pass roles to delete.any. Oh, that's not so fast. Any. Oh wait. Sign-in manager.user manager.remove from roles async. It takes a user and a list of strings. And that's it. Now it looks way more cleaner. Wonderful. Now let's wrap this. Actually, let's leave it as it is. Okay, now let's test our implementation. So let's go back here and quickly fix this. So we're gonna redirect to our action. We're gonna redirect to our edit action. And we're going to pass a parameter. What do we pass to our edit? We pass ID. So here we're going to set ID is equal to user.id. Okay, once we do that, let's rebuild the project. Let's come back to our controller, refresh, save. Okay, it reloads the same page. Okay, so now let's add our modify roles for users and see if they're being given access to these pages. For this, I'm going to open an incognito. Let's copy the URL. Let's paste. Okay, so here I'm going to go to our users list and modify test3. So test3 right now has administrator and manager. So the only credential I'm going to give them is the user, and let's save. Let's refresh. Okay, so we are here. We're going to log in as test3. Log in. Okay, now let's try go to the manager page. Okay, we don't have access. That's great. Let's go to the admin page. We don't have access. Okay, we have access to the role page. Wonderful. Now let's add access again to the manager page. Save. Let's go to the manager page. Okay, it's still access denied because we're still logged in. Let's log out and log back in. Test3. And let's enter our password. Okay, now let's go back to our manager page. This time we have it. Wonderful. Okay, so our role management page works beautifully.